Recording it started, and we'll be sending out some information regarding that and the upcoming AGM. So, without further ado, take it away, Terry.
Thank you, Kyle. Just confirm you can see my arrow cursor moving around.
Yes, it's itty bitty, but I can see it.
All right. Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining tonight. I'm excited to review this talk with you all and get right into it. So before we actually talk about Portuguese, it's worth mentioning, as Kyle did in the introduction, that there were other people in Nova Scotia when the Europeans showed up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's worth mentioning that the Mi'kmaq were here at the time. They were sort of an advanced culture all on their own, although the Europeans certainly didn't think so. So just acknowledge that Mi'kmaq had 7 districts, and they had a large population before the European diseases took their toll. And there was also the Norsemen who visited Atlantic Canada around 1,000 years ago. And they had intentions to colonize it, but it didn't quite work out. So there's still evidence of that can be seen in northern Newfoundland right now. And so I'm not going to mention really that much more about this, but I just thought it was worth acknowledging it at the beginning. So following those activities of the Norse, there was sort of a hiatus for a while due to the bubonic plague and other conditions happening in Europe that kind of delayed any further expeditions to the New World. But eventually things got into high gear starting in the early 15th century. The Portuguese began to take advantage of new developments in ship technology and make voyages of exploration to various parts of the world. So initially, they were going down the coast of Africa with Henry the Navigator having a program of exploration. And then Bartolomé Diaz eventually reached the Indian Ocean in 1488. So you have all these blue dots over here belonging to Portugal. And of course, sailing for Spain, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. And a Portuguese expedition by Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. So really, at this point in time, the beginning of the 16th century, there were really 2 world superpowers, Spain, highlighted here in red, and Portugal in blue. Now, other countries did have activities, but they were much more limited, as you can see from this map. So it's kind of interesting to think of Portugal that way as a world superpower, because of course today it's a very small country with limited impact on the world stage. But so we're going back over 400 years, and the world was a different place. I just wanted to have that setting. Now, in school, we learn of Europeans visiting Atlantic Canada. We don't usually hear much about Portuguese. We hear about John Cabot, who sailed for Britain, and he reached Newfoundland in 1497. In some sense, he's often considered the discoverer of North America because Columbus, of course, was limited to the Caribbean and South America. And then, of course, Jacques Cartier came about 40 years later or so, and he explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So these are 2 very famous European explorers that opened up Europeans' understanding of Atlantic Canada. But we rarely hear about the Portuguese, who were here much before that, and also did tremendous amount of exploration and even tried settlements as well. When we talk about settlements, we normally hear of like Port Royal, for example, which was settled by the French in 1605. Sometimes it's even called the first European settlement in Canada. There's a photo of what it looked like as a reconstruction in 1941. Now that fort was burned in 1613 by the New Englanders, and It was never really rebuilt, although another fort was built at what is now um, Fort Anne by the Scots under William Alexander in 1629. So that eventually was ceded to France, and eventually the British conquered it in 1710. And so that became the Annapolis Roll of today. So that's kind of the setting that people are familiar with. We're going to talk about some of the Portuguese activities that very few people really hear much about. And our introduction to that is Champlain, because most people have heard of Champlain, that he was involved in the first settlements in Nova Scotia by the French in 1605 and in subsequent years as well. He was mainly a cartographer, though, and he's quite famous for having written his journals, multi-volume journals of New France. He his cartography was really cutting edge for the time. Here are some of his maps. You can see the iconography here is a little bit confusing because this, what looks like a castle up here, is actually Port Royal, the habitation that we just saw in a photograph a few minutes ago. And the other houses are actually Mi'kmaq settlements. So they were probably more like wigwams in reality. He drew them in as little houses. Now, speaking about Champlain with relationship to the Portuguese, because one of the big things that he did is he actually mentioned the fact that the Portuguese were in Nova Scotia ahead of him. And in particular, he mentions finding a large rotten wooden cross near Parsborough Harbor in 1605. And he says at that time that it was completely rotted. And so we know in the climate in Nova Scotia, an unprotected wooden cross or wooden construction will take about 50 years to completely rot away, roughly. So that means that the cross was probably erected in the mid 1500s sometime. And the prime suspects for having put that cross up in Parsborough are the Portuguese. And in fact, the Portuguese had a habit of erecting crosses in the various places they went, like the dots we were seeing on that map earlier. So here's another map of Cape Breton Island. And this one is by Belin, who's a French cartographer. It's dated to 1744. Look at what we now call the Bredor Lakes. In French, it's called Les Lacs de Labrador. So not the Bredor Lakes, not the Golden Arm Lakes, but the Lakes of Labrador. Now that's an interesting terminology. It later became corrupted to the Bredor Lakes, but originally it was the Lakes of Labrador in French. And Labrador is a Portuguese word, and it means sort of a gentry farmer, a landowner who subdivided his lands to tenant farmers. So the Labrador was a wealthy Portuguese position in society. Now, we think of Labrador as part of Newfoundland, which is up to the north. So that was a different explorer, Portuguese explorer, who was also called the Labrador because he had that title. That was his social standing. And he did undertake voyages to the north with other explorers, and he ended up having his name associated with that Labrador. But this Labrador here in Cape Breton, the Bredor Lakes, is a different individual. And we'll talk more about him in a minute. But he was a Portuguese person that ended up with his name associated with this part of Cape Breton Island. So getting back to Champlain and his journals, he wrote that the Portuguese attempted to settle upon this island and spent a winter there. but the severity of the climate and the cold made them abandon their settlement. So at the point in Champlain's journal where he makes this statement, he is giving sort of a general review of Cape Breton Island. Now, by coincidence, the very thing that Champlain wrote prior to this statement was a description of Ingonish. And so people have mistakenly associated this paragraph with the fact that he was talking about Ingonish. And since Ingonish actually has a large island associated with it, it was an easy mistake to make because Champlain just says this island. And so you think, oh, the island he was just mentioning. But no, in fact, he's going back to his general description of Cape Breton Island. And so he's talking about the Portuguese attempting a settlement in Cape Breton Island. Now, Champlain did not know where in Cape Breton Island they had attempted the settlement. And in fact, we still don't know for sure today where that was. Okay, I was mentioning the Labrador Lakes, originally called Lakes of Labrador. And it's also interesting that what we now call Sydney was originally called the Bay of the Spaniards. And you can see it here, Baie des Espagnols in French. So why Espanol? If I'm talking about Portuguese, shouldn't it be Baie des Portugais? Well, what happened was in 1583, Spain conquered Portugal. So at this time that Champlain was writing, Portugal did not exist as an independent nation and would not exist again until 1644. So during this period, people didn't really refer to Portugal anymore. They referred to it as Spain because Portugal had been captured and taken over. So where you see Spanish River, that is evidence that the Portuguese had a presence there prior to the French. I'm getting ahead of my my points here on my bullets. All right, so who was the person who founded this settlement in Cape Breton that Champlain was referring to? Well, his name was João Alvarez Fagundes. He was the Labrador, or Lavrador in Portuguese, who attempted to settle Cape Breton Island. And even though he was, in fact, from northern Portugal, on his voyages to the New World, to Atlantic Canada, he gathered settlers from the Azores. So the Azores had a big role in expeditions to Atlantic Canada by the Portuguese. Now, we can go into the old documents in the Portuguese archives and find the evidence that says that Fagundes was given a patent to found a settlement in this part of the world, in Atlantic Canada. And along with that, there's another individual, Pero de Barcelos, who also is mentioned as having been given royal permission to attempt settlements. Now we have much less documentation on Barcelos' attempts, so we're not really sure where he tried it, but it was likely in a different location than Fagundes. Barcelos and Fagundes knew each other because they were together in some exploration voyages that Fagundes undertook in the early 1520s. Barcelos was in fact his second in command on those exploration voyages. Now, getting back to Fagundes, one of the best references we have historically to his settlement is from Francisco de Souza, who was a Spanish governor of Madeira in 1570, and he wrote that he had the intention to go and visit the settlement of Fagundes. So in 1570, it was still unclear what had happened to that settlement. So the document that has survived from de Souza says that they reached North America with a now in a caravel. And first they went to Newfoundland and then decided that it was too cold for their purposes and went further south to another location, which we have every reason to surmise was Cape Verde Island. So there's even a monument in downtown Halifax today to honor the Portuguese settlement in Cape Breton Island by Fagundes. Dr. Robert McGee, in one of his books, has suggested that the Myra River might have been the location. But of course, nothing has ever been confirmed as to where that would be, where the settlement took place. Now, it's interesting that a couple of years before Fagundes got his patent, he did do a survey of most of Atlantic Canada to try to decide where he was going to settle. Some of the cartography we have gives us a hint that Barcelos may have tried his settlement in the Mahone Bay area, but it's not conclusive. But what happened was, because Fagundes had collected detailed information about Atlantic Canada, that eventually found its way into some of the critical cartography that Portugal was compiling at this time. I mentioned earlier that Champlain in the early 1600s was the first truly modern cartography. And however, the Portuguese were getting close. Okay, so this is a map of 1554 by Lopo Homem. And it's more primitive than Champlain's cartography, but it's getting pretty good. There's problems with it, but it's better than a lot of the stuff that came before. Now this map was considered state secret at the time. It was compiled in Lisbon, and you weren't allowed to share it with the public. It was for royal purposes only. Because other maps compiled by other cartographers of the same period are much, much more primitive. And they don't, for example, do not show the Bay of Fundy. We're going to look at the Bay of Fundy a little bit more in a moment, but this is a map of the whole world. And look at how much attention is being given to the Bay of Fundy. They're showing the Bay of Fundy around the same size as almost all of the UK. So clearly, the Portuguese had a very strong interest in Atlantic Canada and the Bay of Fundy in particular. So that is due to the exploration activities that Fagundes undertook in 1520. Now, the line of demarcation is shown. That's this solid line here, and you can see how it chops off part of Brazil, which is accurate, but in reality, Nova Scotia was not that close to the line. Okay, so here's another map similar to the one that I showed earlier, again showing the line of demarcation. And you can see, in reality, Nova Scotia was not close to it. So this was a treaty that was undertaken by Spain and Portugal to basically divide up the known world into a Spanish half and a Portuguese half. So then they felt they had a mandate at that point to colonize any lands that were not already taken by other European powers and claim them for themselves. So getting back to the Bay of Fundy, this is zooming in now on the Bay of Fundy as it appears in the Lopo Homem map of 1554. And the detail here is quite remarkable. A lot of place names are shown. They're a little bit hard to read, but some of them have actually survived into names that we are familiar with today. Of course, the Bay of Fundy being a prime one, which was called Bay Fundo, meaning the deep bay, because not that it was deep in bathymetric depth, but it went very far inland. So what I've done here is I've rotated that map we were just looking at, and so that we can read the place names, and it looks a little bit more familiar in that the Bay of Fundy is more horizontal rather than vertical. And I've taken the liberty to, in red italics, identify the various geographic features that appear on this map and with the names they would have today. So it's really quite remarkable how accurate these details are. In other words, um, islands that you would expect to see are pretty much there. They may not always be in exactly the modern location, um, but there really aren't very many important islands that are missing. There's a few errors, like Cape Chignecto appears to be shown as an island instead of um, part of one long peninsula. Whoops. And it's not perfect by any means, but even the Shubenacadie River appears to be on this map, along with the Avon River. Long Island, of course, was later joined to the mainland by the Acadians with dikes. This is Grand Pre. And it's remarkably similar to the true shape of the original Long Island in the Minas Basin. And even Bear River and the Annapolis Basin appear to be highlighted, Digby Gut. And here is an interesting place name. It's called Les Jardins, which I'm pretty sure can be traced now to be what is now known as Jordan River. The French called it Les Jardins, meaning the gardens. And I think it was a corrupted form from this Portuguese notation of Les Jardins. And St. John River is there as well, and the St. Croix. It's pretty impressive. All right, so going on a little bit to other features of this Lopohoman map. Now, it's very hard to make out, but here is Cape Breton Island, and there are also quite a few place names along the coast of Cape Breton Island. You can't see them on this map, but other cartographers have been able to read them in a more legible facsimile or the original copy. And in particular, Ganong was able to identify 7 place names on this map that he says can only be of Mi'kmaq origin, that they're not even European words. They're words that can be traced to the Mi'kmaq language. So Ganong's suggestion is that this is very good evidence that the Portuguese, beginning with Fagundes, had a very close friendship treaty with the Mi'kmaq, that they got along, that they shared information and helped each other out. I mean, it's sort of speculation in a way, but these place names had to come from somewhere, and they're much more likely to be of Mi'kmaq origin than any other explanation. So it's sort of documentary evidence of this friendship that existed between the Portuguese and the Mi'kmaq. All right, well, a lot of people have considered the possibility that the Portuguese had early settlements in Nova Scotia, but there were some mistakes that were made. And one of the big ones was that a ruined fort was found at St. Peter's in Cape Breton Island. And it was thought at that time in the 1800s to have been of Portuguese origin. However, we now know from more modern investigation of the ruins that it was actually a fort belonging to Nicola Denny. So we don't actually have evidence that the Portuguese were in St. Peter's, even though there are some old texts that claim that that's the case. Another big one is the livestock that was found on Sable Island. So this is Sable Island out, 200 kilometers off Nova Scotia on the Scotian shelf. And So there was livestock found there, and people began to suggest in the 1800s that it may have been Portuguese that had either tried to settle there or place livestock there to replenish their stocks while they were traveling on their ships. However, modern scholarship believes that these livestock were most likely arrived there from shipwrecks. Although, another source, it's known that Colonel John Gorham did place livestock on Sable Island in advance of the New England attack on Louisburg in the 1740s. So probably not Portuguese livestock on Sable Island. And I also mentioned the mistake that was made about Ingonish Island. Now, that's not to say that the Portuguese never went to Ingonish Island. Oh, maybe they did, but Champlain didn't finger it as the location for that Fagundes settlement. So another mistake. But what about artifacts? Well, I'm going to say there aren't many, or there aren't any. There aren't any that have really been confirmed, but there are some that are possibilities. And I find this particular one quite interesting. So this is a clay pot that was found by Ray Boutlier in a underwater cave beneath Shut-in Island, which is in St. Margaret's Bay, somewhere around 1980. Now, I've never been able to figure out exactly when he found it. I'm showing here on the right side of your screen everything that I know about this artifact, which was all due to a journalist named Lillian Crooks, who wrote a book on the history of Indian Harbor. And I've tried to track this down and find who has the artifact now and if there's a report on it. And I've just not been able to get very far at all. Apparently, it was taken to the museum and dated to the 1500s and said to be of Spanish manufacture. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, in the 1500s, especially the late 1500s, people called things Spanish, even though they were, ethnically Portuguese, because Spain had conquered Portugal at that point. So, and the two cultures are very similar anyway. So, Spain being the bigger dominant culture, be normal just to call something Spanish, even though maybe in reality it was Portuguese. It's really hard to tell the difference. And here's another very interesting artifact. Now, I almost hesitate to show it because it's embroiled in so much controversy, and many people think that it's really nothing. But I've investigated this artifact quite closely, and I find it extremely likely to be genuine. I've tried to investigate every possible, negative angle to criticize it as much as I can, but everything seems to add up. So what this is a piece of slate that was found buried underground near Ardoise, Nova Scotia, which is close to Windsor. It's sort of halfway, not exactly half, but partway between Windsor and Halifax. And of course, that is a well-known Mi'kmaq canoe route that goes up the Sackville River and then down Weir Brook into Minas Basin and the St. Croix River. Anyway, a farmer named Mariette found this on his property and he brought it to the museum to have it evaluated. And in 1885, the museum folks at the time thought he was trying to play a trick on them. And that's what they told him. They said, we think this is a fake. Well, Mr. Mariette was not impressed at all. He was very insulted, very upset, and he took his artifact home and he said, "You will never see this again." Um, he completely shut it up, and it was not seen in public again. But it was handed down through the family, and it is now his great great granddaughter who has it in her possession, and she is very much interested in having it properly evaluated by archaeology, if at all possible. So it's a burial marker. It's the Latin expression means here lies, see Manulus, and Manulus is a Portuguese sounding name. And the date is the year, A meaning anno, um, M for 1,558. So 1558. Because there is sort of a military insignia on it, it's suggesting that Manulus may have been a military person. Um, you see this hole, this is a piece of slate, and it's likely that this hole was where this marker was affixed to a post or a tree. And I'm guessing that this arrow is actually pointing to maybe where the grave actually was. If there was maybe it was a pile of stones or a shallow grave, I don't know. It probably wasn't, a grave was probably not dug right under the tree due to roots and that. So, but they needed some place to affix the marker. This is all my speculation, but it seems to, be reasonable. We could, discuss this artifact, have a whole lecture just on this one artifact, but I'm just giving you some teaser type facts about it tonight. In particular, the shield, the sword and the shield. Now, a lot of you see shields everywhere. Like people were military people in the 1500s and 1600s had shields on their graves all the time. But this is not your average shield. Look at the shape of it. It's square at the top and kind of pointy at the bottom. This, in heraldry, this is referred to as a trapezoidal shield. And it's somewhat unusual. You don't see it that often. One of the few places that I've been able to find it, now I've found it in other places too, but only a handful of places actually use a trapezoidal shield in the iconography or in heraldry. And this is one of the few depictions I have seen, which is of King Sebastian of Portugal, who ruled at exactly that time, that when the artifact is dated. Now, the statue was carved at a later date in the 1800s, but presumably the artist who carved this statue chose the shield because he knew it was appropriate for King Sebastian. I'm just guessing here, I don't know. So this is a statue that is in Lisbon, although it has been damaged since this photograph was taken. So you can't actually go to Lisbon and see it anymore. I think it's in pieces and storage in a museum perhaps right now. All right, another very controversial artifact is known as the Overton Stone. This is a boulder with very interesting carving on it. Now, what immediately strikes people, and me in particular, is the shape of this cross. It's not your typical French cross or English cross or Scottish cross. It's more of a Portuguese cross. When you go to Portugal, you see crosses of this style everywhere. And they date from the 1600s and 1500s. This boulder is near Yarmouth. It's near the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. And it's suggested that it might represent a friendship treaty between the Mi'kmaq and the Portuguese, because the symbols here are this Christian cross of Portuguese style and what can be thought of as an eagle feather, which is an important icon in Mi'kmaq ideology, as well as perhaps a couple of tobacco leaves. And also a picture of the crescent moon, which might symbolize the Great Spirit, the Creator, as witnessing this treaty. Now, admittedly, this is just total speculation, but we do have evidence that there was a friendship between the Mi'kmaq and the Portuguese, and we do have evidence that Fagundes did explore the Bay of Fundy. So is this cross also a form of Portuguese land claim marker? Maybe it is, because the Portuguese had a habit of erecting these pedreo crosses in all different places where they went to claim their territory. Now, your traditional portrayed cross looks more like this, with a pillar and a Portuguese emblem, and either a stone cross or sometimes a metal cross on top. And so this is a picture I took myself in Portugal. This one on the left, and the one on the right is from a museum somewhere. I forget exactly where, which one, but there's quite a few of these crosses, either in museums or in replica form around the world. But they're not always in that form. Other forms are historically known, and here's a very interesting one in Africa on the Lower Congo. It's called Yellow Rock, and you can see in this case, all they did was carve a picture of a cross and a Portuguese insignia, and then an inscription as well. So it's not always a pillar. It's not always a literal cross on top of the pillar. I found this picture on the internet, so I'm crediting the person in the picture who posted it. And here's another example. Now, this one is from the Cape Verde Islands. And you can say, well, anybody could have carved this graffiti, but it's known to have been found on the Cape Verde Islands at an early date. And traditionally, the historians on Cape Verde Island attribute this particular cross to Portuguese sailors who first arrived there in 1462. So I don't know what the proof is. I haven't seen those documents, but this is what I've read, and there's no reason to doubt it. I don't think that this type of um, way of making a claim, establishing the fact that you were there by carving a cross into a rock, is known to be something the Portuguese did. Another interesting point is the circle around the cross with the dots. You do see that in different places in Portugal. Now, here is an example on the tomb of Henry the Navigator. So it's not an exact match, not saying it's perfect, but you have a similar crossover here with the flares on the arms. And now this is a different cross, but you do have a circle around it and these roseate dot-like things as well. So, it's suggestive, if nothing else. And also, these are the insignia of the Knights of Christ. And again, it's not a perfect match, but you do see how the flared arms are an important part of that symbology. Now, the Knights of Christ were a military order, military religious order that was under the King of Portugal in the 1400s and 1500s. And it still exists today, but it was really only active in those early periods in terms of exploring the world and stuff. Now, red roofing tiles from Cape Sable Island. This is one that I picked up myself. We don't really know where these red roofing tiles come from. I just found this one, but other people have found bucket loads of them at the Hawk on Cape Sable Island. And it's interesting to me that Dr. Robert McGee, in one of his publications, has suggested that it would be worthwhile to look for red roofing tiles near the shore in Nova Scotia, as it could be diagnostic of where the Fagundes settlement was located. So we'll have to see if any further archaeology can be done on Cape Sable Island and maybe identify the origin of these red roofing tiles. So that brings my main presentation to a conclusion, and I'll be interested to take any questions that have come up.
Thanks a lot, Terry. Great presentation, very interesting. I'm handing off a baby right now. we're, as Terry said, we're open for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself, or feel free to just type into the chat, and we can relay the questions to Terry, and who hopefully has some time for us to answer some questions.
Absolutely.
On a trip to Labrador, I think there was a place called Red Bay, which was supposed to be the remains of the red tiles that were carried by the Portuguese.
Yeah, good point. Red Bay is in Labrador, and it is a major Basque fishing settlement.
Ah,
Yeah, so the Basques were active there in the 1500s, and so they also had red tiles. And so, in fact, on the Cape Sable Island site, the Basques are definitely one of the main groups that are thought to perhaps have left the tiles there. So, yeah, these things are not, are not easy to figure out. There's often more than one possibility, but I'd encourage people to visit Red Bay. It's a fantastic location. It's really well, curated by Parks Canada, and it's a wonderful site where you can learn about the early Basque fishery in Labrador.
and also, how about Strawberry Hill near Canso? There's some drying racks there, apparently. Something to do with drying codfish. Now, maybe again it was the Basque. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't know either. I mean, definitely Canso was a site where cod was dried at an early date. Whether there's anything there that can be associated with the Portuguese culture, I really don't know. But yes, absolutely, Canso was a prime hub for cod drying.
We have a few questions coming into the chat here, so I can start going through those for you, Terry. They're coming in fast, so I'll try and go through them. Gary asks, any conclusive evidence of Portuguese ports or settlements near or in Halifax?
No, not that I know of. But the problem there is that the most desirable locations in Halifax, like near the shore, would have been um, reused by the French. And so what we would find now, if anything remains at all, it would be what the French have left behind. Now, whether the Portuguese did other things further from the shore that the French didn't obliterate, that would be a topic for another another talk, perhaps. I want to get into it right now.
Yeah, we'll see how what comes out from these questions. Maybe there could be some a follow-up at some point.
Yeah.
Wesley says, "Hi Terry, interesting presentation. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on the Barcelos settlement attempt?"
Yeah, there's the cartography that suggests that it might have been in Mahone Bay involves an island that is hard to know which island it's really referring to, but it does appear to be in Mahone Bay, and it's colored red as opposed to all the other islands that are colored blue, and it's called the island of San Bardeo. And it's known that San Bardeo was the patron saint of the Barcelos family. So that's about it. It's That's the closest thing to a documentary evidence of where the Barcelos settlement attempt may have happened.
Great. Anne asks, "Do you know whether the Mi'kmaq have oral histories of interactions with the Portuguese?"
That's a hard one. The oral histories like that have largely been lost over the years due to the extreme hardship that the Mi'kmaq had to endure, particularly in the early 1800s, where their numbers went down to less than 1,000, like less than 500 even. So tremendous amount of oral history was lost during that period. But yeah, there are fragments. Like, for example, Member 2, some of the things that Member 2 said seem to indicate that he did have interaction with uh, early groups that preceded the French. Also, I believe there are some elements in the Mi'kmaq language that are borrowed words certainly from Norman and Breton. And I'm not 100% sure about Portuguese, but I think there may be a couple that derive. So don't quote me on that, but that's about the extent of it. Like it's very fragmentary, if any.
Alessandra says, "What would a Portuguese settlement have looked like? How many people and dwellings? I guess in a typical settlement."
Well, it would
If
be
you
very primitive style huts. Like if you uh, are familiar with that movie, um, uh, what's it called? William Wallace. What's that movie called?
Braveheart,
Braveheart. Yes, Braveheart.
yeah,
The type of huts that they lived in Scotland, like um, sod roof and sod walls or stone walls. Um, uh, yeah, very, very small dwellings. And so it's a small number of people. They're basically subsistence living. In the case of the Fagundes settlement, I didn't have time to get really into a lot of detail about the Fagundes charter, but he was actually given a charter to make soap. That's what he was supposed to do. So he wasn't really a fisherman, Fagundes. He was supposed to produce soap for sale in Europe. And I don't know if they ever actually brought a load of soap to Europe or not, but that's what his charter states, that was going to be his industry, making soap, which for soap you need animal fat, you need wood ashes, and of course you need fuel. So there's lots of wood in Cape Verde Island to make ashes and fuel. And the walrus hunt was very important at around that time in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where walruses were being killed only for their ivory. And you'd be left behind with this huge carcass that had a lot of blubber on it that really was just going to go to waste. So I'm speculating that Fagundes had the idea that he could collect these walrus carcasses and use that blubber to make soap, and not really have to pay much, if anything, for his raw materials.
Kat mentions the supposed tobacco leaves on the stone. Would they be brought in and offered to the Mi'kmaq by the Portuguese? Tobacco was not native to Nova Scotia, so either the tobacco leaves on the Overton stone, or whether they were leaves or eagle feathers.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and it's um, a whole angle that needs to be investigated. But in those early days, there was tobacco in Nova Scotia. It wasn't necessarily the same variety or species that was used in Virginia, but there was a trade also among the natives where tobacco was traded for other things, like maybe stone tools or arrowheads or I don't know what all else. But tobacco did make its way from the places where it was grown plentifully in the New England states up to Nova Scotia in exchange for other trade goods. And also attempts were made by the Mi'kmaq here to grow some reasonable facsimile of tobacco. So it was, even those early days before the Europeans really knew what it was, the Mi'kmaq were using it in one form or another, and it was important to them.
Stacy asks, have the carvings on McNutt's Island been credited to the Portuguese?
No, no, they're not. And if folks may be unfamiliar with it, but there was a life-keeping station um, on McNutt's Island with a lighthouse and survival or life-saving equipment and so on. It's now been abandoned. But there was also Fort McNutt in the Second World War, which is a fairly large, well, not super large, but
Hmm.
large for Nova Scotia standards, military base with anti-aircraft guns um, and big guns, very, very big guns, maybe even anti-ship guns for all I know. But anyway, the guns are still there because they were too big to move. They're huge. Um, but there was a company of American military folks who were stationed on McNutt's Island during the Second World War to man that gun installation. And there's the bedrock that outcrops near the lighthouse um, has a particularly thick and somewhat soft patina or outer coating that takes carvings really well. So even with a screwdriver or a pocket knife or something like that, you can carve fairly nice stone carvings. It's not that hard to do, and there's lots of examples of them all over that outcrop. But one in particular has puzzled people because it's not in any language that people are familiar with. It has some people have suggested it's Phoenician or Iberian or there's various ideas that have been floated as to what it is. Eventually, an archaeologist did track down the source of that inscription, and it turns out to have been due to a Native American who was in the U.S. military stationed at Fort McNutt, who carved, I think it was his name, in his own native, I'm not sure if it was Cherokee or a Navajo or I forget the exact language, but one of those Native American languages that does have a symbolic form. He carved his name, and so that's the explanation for it. That's the best information I have. Not sure if there's an actual reference in print for that, but there might be somewhere.
Great. Skip ahead here. Tamara asks, is there any evidence of any influence to the Mi'kmaq, such as pottery, by the Portuguese as well? Did anyone find Portuguese coins in the Maritimes?
I don't know how, but
Not that I know of, no. To both
Heard
points.
either.
Yeah.
Susan asks, any evidence of women on those voyages or settlement attempts? If there's any documentation of it.
I think there might be. I'm going from my memory. I'm sure the women were there. There's no question that the women were there because it was intended to be a permanent settlement. And even if it was semi-permanent, you would definitely need plenty of women as part of the group. And I'm sure there were also slaves too, although there's nothing about that in the documentary record that I know of. But it was a large contingent from the Azores who went with Fagundes. And I think it might actually say men and women somewhere, but I'm just going from memory. I'm not 100% sure that it says so, but there's no doubt that they were there.
Okay. A few more questions here, if you don't mind. Then we'll give it one last chance for people to ask you a question. But Megan asks, or states, very interesting presentation. Do you know any more about Le Beau Bay, which Champlain named Port Joli?
Good point. Yeah. The best information on those place names is in Ganong. So if you have a copy of his crucial maps, you'll find many pages on that subject in that book. If you don't have a copy, I urge you to get a hold of one, because it's if you're interested in Atlantic Canada cartography and historical toponyms and that sort of thing, it's an indispensable reference.
Paul asks, is Portuguese Cove related to the Portuguese exploration of Nova Scotia?
Interesting. Not as far as I know. It apparently due to a, um, a shipwreck that occurred. Portuguese fishermen were shipwrecked there, and they had to overwinter, but the population accepted them so well, and they felt so much a part of the community that they decided not to leave
Hmm.
when the chance occurred to do so at a later date. So that's my understanding of the origin of Portuguese Cove, but admittedly, it might be hearsay. It may well have some explanation from an even earlier Portuguese presence, but I don't know of any uh, documents or artifacts that would indicate that.
Great. Leo asks, do you know a more exact location on where the Mariette stone was found? Near the shore, further inland, etc.? Any Portuguese records about how Manaus, any Portuguese records about Manaus in general?
No, not on Manaus. I did a search one time on what nations of the world were most likely to have people named Manaus in them. And at that time, I found that Brazil had the most. But I've since tried to redo that search, and it no longer works quite that way. So um, it's unclear. Really, there are no famous Portuguese Manouses that I know of. I've not been able to find anything along those lines, but in terms of where the stone was found, there's actually more to it than what I mentioned in going through quickly, because Mariette, in addition to being a farmer, he also had a gold mine on his property, and it was actually while he was expanding the gold, mining activity, opening up a new vein. This is when they came across the stone. And so it wasn't like his plow that hit it. It was a shovel or a pick or something that they were using to dig, follow a vein of gold that was they were trying to prospect. He had a fairly decent operation there. It wasn't just sort of like one hole digging gold. He even had a crusher and everything. So that makes it even more interesting because if you think of it, um, gold was discovered in Nova Scotia in the 1800s based on float gold. In other words, you walk around in the woods and you see a piece of quartz lying on the ground and you notice it has gold in it. And where did that come from? Well, the glacier dropped it from an outcrop somewhere that it was split off from. And so this is called float gold, things that stones that you find lying on the ground, and you try to trace them back, like follow where the glacier would have dragged them from to find the mother lode. So you can just imagine the Portuguese asking the Mi'kmaq, well, do you know of any place that has this kind of metal? And then they might well have said, well, actually, our canoe route goes right by a spot that's got this kind of rock lying on the ground. That might be why the Portuguese were there, looking for gold, and because we know gold was there, it was mined right in that exact spot. So circumstantial, but very tantalizing.
Duncan says, nice talk, excellent slides, Terry. I would like to remind you of the strange linear multimeter features revealed by LiDAR at the Hawk.
Yes.
Duncan McNeil.
Duncan, thank you so much for your support. And Duncan has sent me some great LiDAR images of the Hawk that I'm hoping to pour through as soon as I get available time.
We'll go a couple more questions here, if that's all right with you, Terry. We have two more.
Yeah.
Great. Carol mentions found the following Portugal Cove. So this is reference to, I think, Portuguese Cove or in Nova Scotia, the earlier question. So Portugal Cove, which appears on maps by 1630, was probably named for the Portuguese fishermen who occupied the cove seasonally in the 1600s, while the English and French dominated St. John's and other major fishing sites on the Avalon Peninsula.
Yeah, keyword there being probably.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough with a lot of this.
It is possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't rule it out, but I've not found any true documentary evidence of that. But it could be.
Ryan says, we were at the Hawk and I was in the water, and there was an obvious man-made stone structure in the water that looks like it was used for fishing. Looks like the stones going out into the water on both sides of the feature looked like they were moved by people for making a safe harbor.
Yeah, I think I know the one you're talking about, and it is really, really huge. It does look like it was man-made because it's something we could do today with heavy equipment, but it's almost certainly natural, even though it really looks weird. It looks like a stone road really going straight out to the sea.
Yeah, you can get some tricky features for sure with
That's right. Yeah.
pieces of bedrock.
Well, it's probably no bedrock there, but it's just the way the currents change over the years, and they build up these cobbled beaches. And then eventually the currents change again, and all the sand is taken away, and you're left with just the stone skeleton, things like that. This is the sort of thing Duncan's referring to with his LiDAR images, because some of these things, are evidence of changing patterns of shoreline erosion over the years. It's not all removal. Some of it is, where shoreline is built up in different directions, and then the shore changes direction, and you're left with kind of the skeleton of a former shoreline.
Right. So I think a final question here from Susan, and I think you've given a couple examples of this, but did the Portuguese come to fish or just to explore?
Well,
Can't
mostly
forget the soap making.
Yeah, mostly fish. The soap making was an exception. That was a one-time thing. But yeah, no, the fish was really important. The codfish and the Grand Banks of Newfoundland was probably the major place where they went. Did they go into the Gulf of St. Lawrence? I'm sure they did. We don't have as much documentation for that I know of anyway. But yeah, the codfish. The codfish was king. That was the major commercial reason to be here.
Great. Wesley's just commenting on that this possible stone feature at the Hawk that Ryan had said that all the stones were fist sized or similar. And Wesley's saying he's familiar with it and possibly a slipway for a smaller watercraft, but yeah, tricky to say, especially over chat here.
Over chat, it might be a different feature than the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, without confirming that we're talking about the same feature. The one I'm thinking of is like
what I'm thinking of is about 200 meters long,
right,
and about 20 meters wide. But maybe this is something different. Oh no! Wait a minute. I think I do know the one you mean. Yeah. It's about the size of a boathouse, really. Yeah. And the stones are more watermelon size if it's that other one. Anyway, yeah, we'll have to do that another time.
For sure. And folks, if you ever end up seeing something that you have questions about, feel free to send the NS Archaeology Society a note, or directly to the Special Places Protection Program at the Nova Scotia Museum. Ideally, they can let you know what you're looking at, or let you know that maybe something they're interested in taking a closer look at.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad we had a good attendance.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Terry. Very interesting presentation, and as always, we always appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.